Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final day of National Women's History Month 2022. So excited to be spending it with all of you and spending it with Jill and her amazing new book, which is also about incredible women. Jill and I both felt that this would be a fabulous way to kind of cap this month of focusing on women's stories and also giving us inspiration to keep going. Right, that March is not the only month that we should be focusing on women's stories and celebrating all of the women in our lives. So welcome. I am super excited about Over, Under, Around, and Through. I just couldn't put it down. Loved every word that talked not only about these incredible women's stories, but also how Jill and Ellie so masterfully created a narrative around them that all of us could resonate with, right? So it wasn't just about these incredible women who literally have been inducted into halls of fame, but that the nuggets that existed around persistence and determination and passion and entrepreneurial thinking that all of us could resonate with, because I think that's what a good book does, right? It gives you that aspirational feel, and yet it doesn't make it so far away that you feel like it's almost fantasy, at least for you. So I thought I would start with Jill introducing herself a little bit and talking about how this book came about, why she wrote it, because it's such a great story and I want her to share it with us. So Jill, welcome. So excited. Thank you for writing this book, and please share with us how it came about.
All righty. Well, I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you, Allie, for putting this together and allowing us to have this conversation. And what I said, I actually had some of this discussion Tuesday night at a reception. And so I wrote some comments for that. Ellie and I actually met, I think, in 1991 when I was national president of the Society of Women Engineers. And I see actually one of my Society of Women Engineers colleagues, Marilee Wheaton, on the call today. And we became friends, and she was my mentor and my sponsor, and we participated together in Girl Scouts and the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, the International Women's Forum. We were both nominated unsuccessfully in 2008, and in 2010, I did her nomination and was successful. I was also inducted in 2010. And then she told me about this committee that the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame had put together called the Legacy Committee. And what it was doing was working with the Denver Public Library to get all of the papers from the inductees into the library. The libraries around the world actually don't have very many historical records of women. They have historical records of men. And one of the ways to ensure that women's stories are told is to make sure that their records are saved as well. And then the Denver Public Library offered the hall the 7th floor space for an exhibit. And in 2016, and Ellie and I met in her kitchen table over a series of weeks or months to put together what we thought that exhibit should look like. And it served as the framework of what the committee did. And Ellie got pretty sick actually in 2016 and in and out of issues and health problems. And so I started becoming her chauffeur. And so I took her to lots and lots of things. And we got friendlier and friendlier. And I actually should have said in the beginning, her husband, Manny Greenberg, became my surrogate father. My father's name was Manny Stein. My mom's sister married Norman Greenberg. So both my father and my uncle were deceased by the time that I met Ellie and Manny Greenberg, and Manny became my surrogate father. And I thought it was divinely inspired because he had my father's first name and my uncle's last name. And they went with me through my divorce and my remarriage. And he went, I don't know what she sees in him, all the standard stuff. Make sure you have a prenup, all of those things. And so in 2020, we had, as everyone on this call knows and the whole world knows, we had a pandemic. And I was on a virtual happy hour And someone on the virtual happy hour was a former board member of the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. And she said, somebody should write a book. Actually, I think she said, Jill, you should write a book on how women in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame overcame obstacles. So I had a conversation. Her name was Jill Wright. I had a conversation with her after the happy hour, and I emailed Ellie and I said, you want to do this? She said, sure. So June 2020, on her back patio, socially distanced as required at that time, we were having the initial discussion. And I said to Ellie, well, Ellie, what do you do when you have a problem? And she went like this. And that's when I knew we could write the book, because she didn't see obstacles and problems as obstacles and problems. She figured out a way, and of course now we call it over, under, around, and through. And so we sat down, we figured out what we were going to do. We wanted to have 30 women. We got 31 interviews that we did, about an hour each. And so we had this massive amount of material, 31 hours of interviews. I did the transcripts, and we said, well, what are we going to do with it? And as normally happens for me anyway, I don't know about anyone else here, but in the shower one day, my brain went, stories. We're going to tell stories. And so I wrote the stories, and we did 50, because 50 is a good number. And we had 10 skills that we had identified. It's actually really a little bit more than 10, but you know, every list has to have 10. So we smushed some together. So it's mental intelligence, emotional intelligence, social support, moral compass and spirituality smushed together, determination, perseverance, and persistence smushed together, creativity, optimism, resilience, action orientation, and passion. And as we wrote the stories, we gave them each a name that was relevant to the story. And then we slotted them where they fit. And so, yes, there are 50 stories, but it's not 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 all the way down. It's how they slotted. And so we signed the book contract the 28th of April, 2021. We got the book cover in August. Ellie saw the book cover before she died. And we got the proofs. She might have seen the proofs. It's not clear to me whether she did see the proofs or not. And then I saw the book for the first time in January, and it's actually, as you saw, that Allie has a copy and I have a copy. So the pre-release copies are available. I signed a ton more yesterday, and the book is going to be released on May 3rd. And initial feedback has just been overwhelmingly positive.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much. And oh, yes, you already got your copy. Amazing. And I hope everybody also gets her copy. We can put the link again into the chat. Really and truly, these stories are, they're page turners, because you almost can't believe they are possible, right? This is not apocryphal or fantastical or, you know, some sort of a superhero, but yet each one of these women was an incredible hero in her own right, incredibly daring, incredibly entrepreneurial in her thinking, even if she wasn't necessarily an entrepreneur. And that was part of what was meaningful to me as a woman who is dedicated to serving and supporting women entrepreneurs and founders. Whenever I see these stories that I feel are relatable as well as aspirational, I want to share them as widely as possible, because I think all of us could use as much support and as much can do as we can possibly get. So Jill, along those lines, you know, some of the women talked about others who enabled them along the way, or, you know, to use kind of Elizabeth Gilbert speak, you know, gave them permission. What would your advice be to women who are feeling right now like they have that passion, but somebody needs to give them permission, or somebody needs to enable them? Stories from your past, or any kind of advice you'd have for us, given this is your 12th book, given you have been an incredible ceiling breaker in so many of the things you've done, including all of your work in engineering?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say, and I've also been through a lot of counseling personally, is that you can give yourself permission. You do not have to wait for someone else to give you permission. And you are reminding me actually of a couple of things. And I'm going to just find one of them right now, and then maybe I'll find the other one as well. Carlotta Lanier is one of the women in this book. And Carlotta Lanier was the youngest of the Little Rock Nine, the 9 African-American students that integrated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. She was 14 years old. And she's been inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame as well. And what she says is that she had to learn how to rely on herself. She had to develop trust in herself. And for those of you that don't know that story, very, very briefly, those 9 students were escorted to school every day of the 1957-1958 academic year, first by the 101st Airborne Unit of the Army, and then by the Arkansas National Guard. They were harassed every day. They were taunted every day. She said she had no one to do her homework with. She had no friends. She couldn't participate in any extracurricular activities. So she really had to rely on herself. And then, Allie, as you and I talked briefly before the call started, there's another story in here. Larae Arulian, who was the first president of Women's Bank, when she was 7 years old, she was being harassed on the school ground. And she did actually get permission from her mother. Her mother said, poke him in the nose. And she poked him in the nose, and he left her alone after that. And she learned to stand her ground. And that's what the title of the story is. I learned to stand my ground. And so, and there's, I mean, social support is one of the categories, one of the skills in the book. And there are many women in here, you know, who did have some kind of very important social structure, whether it was family or friends or colleagues. I already mentioned Society of Women Engineers and my friend Mary Lee Wheaton. I couldn't have made it throughout my career without the support that I got from the Society of Women Engineers. I mean, I started college in 1972, and that was the first year that the percentage of women getting BS degrees in engineering in the US reached 1%. And so it was very important to me. And what I also say, I mentioned the 10 skills. Most people don't use one of them. They use them in some kind of combination, and then it depends what the issue or the problem is, you know, which ones you use together in order to solve a problem.
You know, I think that kind of, you know, multidisciplinary, if you will, approach to living your life is also such a critical part of women's success, because we are accessing pieces of our humanity that at other points may have been called, my favorite, the soft skills, right? We now know that they are not only soft skills, but thank you, Seth Godin, for giving us a new adjective. How about instead we call them human skills? And that our human skills are actually going to enable us. And that was something that I was struck by over and over and again. The women in these stories spoke of making connections, right? Whether it was to themselves or to others, recognizing that this, you know, kind of in a more, you know, gendered world that many of them were growing up in, they took what somebody may have seen as a liability, their deep connections to others, and they created it as an asset, and how they got buy-in and how they got support. And I think that what I'd love to hear you talk about is, along with the women in this book, you have written 12 books, many of them have had co-authors. How have you worked with women to do the things that you wanted to get done? Could you give us a few examples of times in your life where it was really you and they in terms of creating that community that pushed something important forward?
Well, I'm sorry to keep bringing it up, but it is really true. I mean, in 1970, I graduated from college in 1976. In 1979, I found the Society of Women Engineers, joined on the spot, became active when I moved to Denver in 1981. And that was where I learned really so many basic skills. Through that group, I learned, well, I already was a speaker by that point in time, but I got more of skills. But I learned budgeting, and I learned strategic planning, and I learned facilitating, and I learned organizing projects and project management and networking and all of those kinds of skills in an environment where I was supported. And to me, that was SWE, that's what Society of Women Engineers, SWE is what we call it, a family unit where I was accepted for who I was. I mean, in the workplace, prove myself, prove myself, prove myself, prove myself, prove myself, prove myself over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. You know, you don't look like a woman engineer, or you look like a woman engineer, none of those things which make sense. And so, and then working with my co-authors to produce volumes and books that we believe in. I mean, the first Her Story book, and I did have the foresight to put it right in my hand reach. Her Story, A Timeline of the Women Who Changed America. Mary Lee has had me come speak in California a couple different times on this book. 850 Women in U.S. History from 1587 to 2011. I mean, I didn't know when I found that book and when we did that book that that was going to be life-changing for me, and then I was going to be dedicated to telling women's stories and writing women into history. And I didn't know when Hollywood Her Story, an illustrated history of women in the movies, I didn't know that story. In the beginning of Hollywood, women had every single role that there was. And then when the movies started making money, which was in the 1920s, they got pushed out. And they're still, we women are still working to get back in. And so understanding how important it is for us, for women to collaborate with each other, to work with each other, to support each other, to advocate for each other. Because let me tell you, the men do it.
They absolutely do. And I think that, you know, given that we are talking about this book in Women's History Month, I'm really appreciative of your continuing to remind all of us that this is about all ships rise in high tide, that this is about that there are plenty of seats at the table, that there is no scarcity, that when we are abundant in our thinking, when we make room for other women, that we all win. And I think that that's a really important message to keep hammering home, because in America in general, we have this kind of warped perception of success is created in a pyramid or in some sort of a, you know, very narrow space at the top. And as such, you need to claw your way to that spot, moving and kicking and you know, kind of pushing people out of it, instead of having this much more kind of, I don't know what, a view of leadership, a view of space, an abundant place where all of us can succeed, and that each of us has a story to tell. And so I would love, when you were interviewing these women, now granted they had already been inducted, so somebody along the way had told them that their story was meaningful. What would you have to say to a woman who, if you were to say, what's your story? And she would say, I don't know, I'm not that interesting. I don't have much to say. How would you help her think differently about her own story? Is it a question you would ask? You know, I'd love to, you know, kind of get some nuggets from you on that one.
Well, it's very interesting that you say that, because way, way back when, so it was probably in 2008, I was at a book signing, and I said to the woman, you know, who was asking me to sign her book, how she would like me to sign it. And she basically said to me, well, I'm not a worthwhile human being. I mean, she didn't use those words, but you know, I'm not important. I didn't do anything. There's nothing to write about. I mean, she stood in front of me and she said all of those things. And none of that is true. what you just said, Allie, is that we each have a story. And each person, I mean, I personally believe that we're each put here with a specific purpose, and that it is our responsibility to find out what that purpose is and then to manifest it and to make sure that it actually gets accomplished. And so that means no one here, no one that is on this earth was put here as an accident. Everyone has a purpose. And I end most of my talks, at least her story, a timeline talks, with a quote from Margaret Mead, which many of you know. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And to me, that quote means that it only takes one person to make a difference. And that means that every person can be that one person. And so when someone says to me, and by the way, there are plenty of women in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame and in the National Women's Hall of Fame who will tell you, well, I didn't do anything important. And I don't really understand why I'm there. And I actually said that for a long time myself. And so if we understand that we are important, and importance, making a difference in the world can be in so many different areas and facets. I did an article on community trusteeship after I finished going through Leadership Denver. And just the list of volunteer activities that people can get involved in, just the categories. There's so many different categories. And then there's so many different places within those categories. There are so many ways that one person can make a difference in the world. And so that's what I say to people, because I don't believe that anyone is unimportant. I mean, this actually goes back into my working days. Well, and people would say this to me and I would just look at them like they were crazy. Well, because it was mostly a she's just a secretary. Don't you understand that secretaries run the world? She only works in word processing. Well, how do you ever, this was back in the days when you sent your document into word processing and somebody typed it all up for you and gave it back to you. Well, how do you expect you're going to get any of your products back if you don't have the right attitude toward those women in word processing? You should really cultivate them because they're important people. Everyone, the janitor. I mean, I can't remember, this was a story during World War II that I heard not that long ago, and I don't think it's an urban myth, I think it's a real story. There was a janitor in a building where Jewish people lived, I think it was in Germany, and he wasn't Jewish. And when the Jewish persecution began, he actually saved the people in the building who had been nice to him. You know, people want to be treated well, and so everyone has value. Their value is different. Every person has different value, but they need to be valued.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about, and this is also partly things that I learned from Lena Fishman, who's on this call, who's the executive director of the Golda Meir House. And one of the things I was thinking about was, and maybe we'll hand it over to her if she wants to speak for a little bit. Golda Meir ended up coming to Denver because her older sister lived here. Her older sister lived here because she had tuberculosis. And then I think about the woman in the book, right, who founded all the hospital systems to help support the people who had tuberculosis. So here I am putting all these amazing pieces together that in the end, Golda Meir, who got an incredible education that she talked about because of the parlor meetings she went to, because she learned about workers' rights and women's rights and socialism, sitting in the teeny tiny kitchen in her sister's house, which you should all go visit, talk to Lena, and her sister was only here because she had tuberculosis, which was helped because of the woman in the book who said, we need to found a hospital system that will help people who were suffering from tuberculosis. So Golda Meir, as we know her, existed because this woman created the thing and her sister got sick. Like, this is what I want everyone to see that even when you can't see the end result of your work, you have no idea how it may truly, truly change our entire world. It's the butterfly effect on steroids, right? We all know chaos theory, right? That even the flap of a butterfly's wings, that small amount of air that it moves, has the capacity to impact on weather systems across the world. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Jill, and these stories that kind of have these incredible ripple effects?
Well, the woman you are referring to is Frances Weisbart Jacobs, and I just want to say a little bit about her, because what you also said about the ripple effect is very important. So Frances Weisbart Jacobs lived in Denver in the late 1800s, and well, she was in Denver during that period of time. She was very, very concerned about the people in the community. Today, we have two organizations because of Frances Weisbart Jacobs. One is United Way. So everybody knows United Way, but that started in Denver and Frances Weisbart Jacobs was involved. And then, as you say, she was, at the time, doctors were sending their patients, basically dumping them to Denver. You know, Denver's going to help you. The climate in Denver is going to help you with what were called consumptives at the time, which was tuberculosis. And Frances Weisbart Jacobs saw these poor people everywhere and began the effort to develop what became National Jewish Hospital, which today is National Jewish Health, the #1 respiratory hospital in the US, probably in the world. She died when I think it's the month after the cornerstone was laid. The cornerstone is the beginning of the building. She didn't actually live to see National Jewish built. Her statue, there's a statue of her in National Jewish, but she had such foresight and such, I mean, she also brought free kindergarten. She went to San Francisco. She saw a free kindergarten. She brought free kindergarten back to Colorado, and the Denver Public Schools implemented it. I mean, and one more story, and then I'll make the point. There are 16 stained glass windows in the Colorado Capitol Dome, honoring pioneers who were of importance to the founding of the state of Colorado. There are 15 men in the dome and one woman. And that woman is Frances Weisbart Jacobs. I mean, she is the epitome of one person making a difference. She died when she was 49. If she had lived to be 89, oh my God, you know, what she could have done, the amazing number of things she could have still contributed after that. And I think that's the point it's one of the points, that one person can significantly make a difference, and all of us face obstacles in our lives, every single one of us. And we need to know, and particularly right now, post-pandemic, maybe hopefully post-pandemic, that we can go over, under, around, and through those obstacles, and we can come out the other side, and we can then become very important contributing members of society.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for knowing your book well enough to know which woman it was. I'm so glad you actually named her. I was too caught up in the moment and I didn't want to be looking through the book while you were speaking. So thank you. Before we go on, does anybody have a question or a thought or an idea? I do want to open it up a bit if anybody wants to speak or talk, and then, you know, Jill or I can be responsive. Does anybody have a thought? You can just raise your hand. Yes, Regina.
I do. So this is just amazing. My family, my kids, we used National Jewish quite often when they were little. And I guess one question is, was Frances Weisbart Jacobs a wealthy woman, you know, to go and be able to do all these things? And part two of that question is, when you're thinking of, like, so right now it's a big deal to me. I've been thinking about legacy, leaving a legacy. What am I doing in my life that, you know, will live beyond me? And So my thought is, or my question is, when you're looking at organizations where you think you would like to give your time and whatever resources you have, do you look for big organizations? Do you look for small organizations? Do you look where you can make the most impact? Like, what kind of are the criteria that a person would want to take, into consideration, when making these decisions?
All right. So I have heard two questions from that. And so let me respond to them in order. That's what I was doing. I was taking notes. Frances Weisbart Jacobs married a man who started a clothing company somewhere in the mountains that way for miners. M-I-N-E-R-S, not miners, M-I-N-O-R-S. Colorado was big mining, gold and silver and lead, and now molybdenum and all of those things. And then they came to Denver and he had a clothing store. And she was very charitable from quite a young adult age. But what I really want to tell you is if you go to the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame website, which is cogreatwomen.org, go look for the film library. And there are 22 films in the film library total. I think the 2 short ones are there as well as the 20 long ones. And Frances Weisbart Jacobs' film is there, and you can find out it's 26 minutes and 40 seconds. It aired on PBS, and you can, and I'm actually in it, but for parts of it, you can learn much more about Frances Weisbart Jacobs, her life. Christine Bonero, who is the CEO of Mile High United Way, is in it. There's a historian in it from the University of Denver who is very knowledgeable on Frances Weisbart Jacobs. And there's also an enactor who enacts Frances Weisbart Jacobs. So you can learn much more about her approach, her mentality. There were 4,000 people at her funeral.
Wow.
4,000 people. She had such a wide-ranging impact on, well, Denver, Colorado, and the world. And she's in the National Women's Hall of Fame also. And then in terms of organizations and legacy, what I'm going to say, and I know that Marilee put a contribution in the chat, is the following, because at one point earlier in my life and career, if anybody asked me to be on their board of any organization, I was so flattered I said yes. And then I got to a point where I went, this is a little ridiculous because I don't have time to do my work because I'm so busy doing all of these other organizations. And so what I would tell you is that I would match interests with organizations. So for example, I have a friend, she's actually the general manager of Austin Energy in Austin, Texas, and she just loves animals. So her volunteer activities are around animal rescue. At one point in time, I went through a book called First Things First. It's by Stephen Covey and the Merrills. And one of the things I got to do in going through that book was to put together my keywords and my personal mission statement. So my keywords in order are women, engineering, and education. Those are mine. Those are not yours. Those are mine. And so women, engineers, and education, I finally got to the point where I had nominated Marion Downs to the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. Marion Downs fought for newborn hearing screening for 40 years until it became universal. She's in the book too. And she picked audiology. It's a pretty interesting story. She picked the shortest line, and that's how she got into audiology. But for 40 years, she fought for exactly. This was back when, in order to register, you don't remember this. Marilee remembers this. back in the day, you went to the gym when you got to college. And in order to register for your classes, you had to go from basically card table to card table to card table. You had to sign up or pick up an IBM punch card or something like that in order to register. She had, I think, 3 kids already. She was going to get her graduate degree. What did she want to do? She picked the shortest line, and that's how she got into audiology. But now, any of you with kids, they were screened, their hearing was screened when they were born because of Marion Downs. Okay, so the point is, I nominated her for the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, and I happened to be at a reception at the Marion Downs Hearing Center at the Anschutz complex, medical complex in Denver. And somebody said, "Oh, you nominated her. You need to be on our board." And I went, "No, I do not need to be on your board. Thank God I finally got here, where I can say no." But if I were interested in that, that would be a good thing for me to do. But I would say, find a place where your talents are wanted in an area that you care about. I've spent a lot of years with Girl Scouts, but guess what? That hits at least 2 of my 3, and sometimes it even hits all 3. And so the Society of Women Engineers, by the way, gets all of them. And so that, and all of the work that I've done in accrediting engineering education, that fits in as well. Plus, I also have, as part of my personal mission statement, that I'm a role model. So in engineering, we still need women role models. So if I'm doing accreditation visits, then I kind of hit, the throw in the women part as well. And so for your efforts, where do you want to spend your time? What do you enjoy doing? And how do you think you can make the most difference? And if you sign up for an organization and you start working with them, and it's not what you want, go find something else. The list is so long of organizations that would benefit from having your skills and your knowledge and your talents. I hope that answered your question.
It did, thank you. Right now, I'm kind of in between 2. So one that's very, very big, and that hits kind of all 3 points of interest of mine. And then one that's much smaller. And I don't know if it would make, they're making an impact in the world, obviously, because I'm considering, doing things for them, but just on a much smaller scale.
It only takes, the way change starts is so small that I don't think the size of the organization is important, except from the standpoint that sometimes smaller organizations benefit more from committed volunteers because of the fact that they're smaller. Sometimes you can get lost in a bigger one, and sometimes not, because in the end, it's all one-on-one anyway, and it's all individual anyway.
Can you put the questions that you asked in the chat? Because I thought that they were very provocative questions. You asked 3 questions just now.
Well, the good news is that we'll have a recording. So Regina, you can go back at 10 minutes. At 10:39, find them, because I think probably Jill, like many of us, when we speak, the minute it's out, it's gone. So
thank you. Because that's not what my notes say.
The good news is you have a recording. Thank you, Regina. Does anybody else have a question or a thought or a comment? If so, you can. Yes, Lena.
Well, Jill, thank you so much. Really, really interesting. I really learned a lot, and I will incorporate all of this information into the stories that we tell in the Golda Meir House Museum. And I look forward to reading the book. I wondered if there's something something special about Colorado, the state of Colorado, that helps to produce these great women. I'm also thinking kind of in the lines of, that Colorado was the first state where women got the right to vote. And is there just something about this state or being out west that helps to cultivate these types of women entrepreneurs and leaders?
Well, I don't think I know the answer to that question, but what I will tell you is I grew up in Virginia. And then I worked in North Carolina for 5 years after attending the University of Virginia and moved to Colorado in 1981. And I love it here. I've been here for more than 40 years. And the West is more, in general, more accepting of women, more open. The Morrill Act, Morrill Act of 1862 was the education act that established the land grant colleges, like Colorado State, Iowa State, Kansas State, all the states. Then they're not all states. I mean, they're not all the state colleges. They don't all have that in their name, but many, many, many of them do. And at that point, the families that had children to send to college said, our girls are going to, which was very, very different than the experiences of women in almost the entire East. And in fact, the University of Virginia, my alma mater, which I didn't say before, women were admitted as undergraduate students in the fall of 1970, and I'm in the third class of women. And so that's very, very different than the University of Colorado or Colorado State or Iowa State or Kansas State or the California colleges, where the first woman graduated in engineering in 1876 from Berkeley. So, and then there's the suffrage maps that I use in many of my talks, where were states that had either partial or full suffrage prior to the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920. And basically, the Western states have colors because they had some partial or full suffrage prior to the 19th Amendment, and then the Eastern states are blank. Not all of them, and the South is blank. And so I think that, I mean, whatever I say is conjecture, and it's an engineer talking as opposed to a psychologist or a sociologist. But once you've come west in those covered wagons, and by the way, they don't look anything like they do in the John Wayne movies. They are really tiny. And those women who came west, think about it. Most of them walked. Most of them either were pregnant, got pregnant, or had a babe in arms and a toddler, or more than one, as they were coming across. I mean, and it was pretty rugged in the West. And so women's roles were very, very important. And how much did that contribute and what made the difference? As I already said, I'm an engineer, and I'm going to let somebody else figure out the answer to that one.
I think you unlocked a piece of it for me, though. I think you're right. It's interesting to think about the types of people that came here and what a woman's role had to be in order to survive out in the West.
Right, and I'm going to make one more comment. You just triggered another thought for me. In the U.S. in general, not African American people whose ancestors were enslaved, but the people that came from Europe over to America, particularly in the very beginning, think about who they were. They were outcasts. They were the second, the third, or the fourth son who were not going to inherit the property. They were rebels and outcasts of very many different types, and people looking for religious freedom and running away from the very long history of persecution and other kinds of issues in Europe. And so even in the East, although certainly more in the West, there's a very, very different kind of mentality and spirit in terms of who came to the US, what became the US.
Absolutely. I love the idea, right? That it's this, we use that frame nature and nurture. And in this case, it's also like individual and institution, right? So you have the women who came who were already, let's call it hardier, because whether they were or whether they became in their journey. Then there were families who needed people to be productive, right? There was none of this, the women are these genteel creatures whose uterus will fall out if they, learn type of language, because everybody needed to actually do things. And then from there, the university system that was created by, for, and with people who already had a mentality that everybody counts. And so then the women, it's this backwards and forwards. And I think that is much of how history has run. And, I am kind of focused on this idea that gender is a story that you were told about you that has nothing to do with who you are, right? It has nothing to do with your individual prowess or potential or power. It's a big part of my speaking about women and how gender should not be something that defines who we are or what we accomplish. And so this idea, again, that gender was constructed in the West differently than it was in the East. It's a construction by people. I love to say to people, if I could show you how this was created by people, would it have less power over you? Because do you really, right? It's not some, kind of inherent biological, or if it's your faith, divine placement. Somebody decided in your neck of the woods that this is what it was going to look like. If you decide differently, you're allowed to do that too, right?
I mean, think about those early women, the ones who came west. Their life was hard. They worked the physical work that they did, because not only did they have to cook and clean 3 meals a day for everybody who was working on the farm and all their kids and everybody else, but then they also had to farm, and they had to milk the cows, and they had to do, kill the chickens and harvest the eggs and, all of that stuff. And it was a hard life. It was an incredibly physical life.
Absolutely. And I think that hearing those stories would also do so much to change the narrative of what women are capable of. I think we're seeing this conversation, whether it's the kerfuffle over critical race theory, whether it is about, Elizabeth Lesser's book, Cassandra Speaks, When Women Tell the Stories, the Human Story Changes. Great book, by the way, right? This idea of who is telling the story and understanding that the person, the narrator, you were talking, Jill, earlier about the fact that women's stories need to go into the archives, right? So that they become a matter of historical record. I started my first job out of college was at the Jewish Women's Archive, whose mission it was to write North American women back into the histories of the United States and Canada. And so I think that was also what resonated with me so completely about your book, was knowing these stories creates a fire in my belly, not only to learn more stories about women, but reminds me every single day of what we are capable of, and that there were women before us who did show us, kind of how it's done. We just don't know they existed, so
Right.
So does anybody else have a question? I had one more question for Jill, but I did want to open it up. Is anybody else? So here's my question for you, Jill. Your commitment to telling women's stories is so profound that you must believe it has extraordinary power. For those of us who want to share these stories, for us who want to harness that power, what are the 2 things that we can do in addition to buying your book? And please remind us again of what that website is. What can we do to continue to help share women's stories that make us all understand our history and our future very differently?
All right, so let me just do this in order, and so I don't forget. The website for the book, pre-release, the release date is May 3rd. So pre-release, you can order the copies, and it's actually really easy. It's over, under, around, and through.com. So that's how you can order the books. I signed more yesterday, so you should be fine. Over, under, around, and through.com. All right. So what's one of the first things that you can do? I'm not sure I've got the second one, but I absolutely have the first one. And Marilee has heard me say this over and over and over again. Nominate women for awards. Nominate them.
I was just putting that note in the chat, Jill.
Yes,
that
thank
was
you.
one of absolutely.
Because
Yeah.
I say it all the time.
Yeah.
There are halls of fame. There are distinguished alumni awards at your university. There are awards from organizations everywhere. United Way has awards. All kinds of organizations have awards. If the women are not nominated for the awards, then no one knows their names and no one knows their stories. And so then I'm going to share a little story with you that happened today. So I don't know how many of you read the comics, but there's a comic today and it's called Baldo, B-A-L-D-O. And the writers are Cantu, C-A-N-T-U, and Castellanos, C-A-S-T-E-L-L-A-N-O-S, or something like that. And the little girl, who is really a dynamo in the strip, her name is Gracie. And she's at school, and it's called Truman Elementary, which I did actually note in the comic strip. And she gets up and she starts talking about Cesar Chavez. And she says Cesar Chavez is her hero. And so I emailed Cantu and Castellanos this morning, right before I got on the Zoom. And I said, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta founded what is today the United Farm Workers. And as outspoken and as informed and as educated as little Gracie is in this comic strip, she would have known about Dolores Huerta. And so she should have said in this comic strip, as far as I'm concerned, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta is still at 91 or 92 or 93, whatever in the 90s she is still working for social justice for those farm workers. She's in the National Women's Hall of Fame and the California Hall of Fame, or whatever it's called. And so we have to start talking about it. Every time we see something, we have to do something about it. Actually, somebody said that at the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame induction ceremony last night. She said, when you see something, you have to say something. And this woman her name is Lupe Brizano, and I'm pretty sure she's in her 80s. She could be older than that. But if you see something, you have to say something. You have to do something. It's not someone else's job to do it. It's our job to do it.
Well, thank you. I think both of those reminders are super important. Nominating women for awards, regardless of whether or not we feel that an award is ever a person's shining moment in that award ceremony, the recognition and the long tail of having been both nominated and awarded has a much bigger reach than I think those of us, right, who aren't awards people, if you will, ever really think about. And that is so important. The recognition, the fact that you get on people's radar screens when somebody has validated that what you have done is meaningful. And yeah, gosh, I just really never thought about how important it is to be thinking about these awards. And to your second point, Jill, absolutely, as the New Yorker, if you see something, say something, right? It was often done on the subway or in other places, and it was about physical safety, right? But when we expand the definition of see something, say something to be who is missing from the record, right? How are we somehow at other types of risks, not necessarily for our physical safety, but when we are not cognizant or when we are not standing up for something that was glaringly, missing or that was potentially intentionally left out, right? Since we won't know the motivation, we need to assume that there was a gap that we needed to remind them needed to be filled. And that's this book. This book is filling so many gaps in the historical record, in addition to being aspirational, in addition to telling women's stories that make me feel so proud and so excited. And it is such, this idea of being a role model, as Jill spoke of. I mean, I can't wait to show this to my kids and to my husband, right? Everything changes when we see what others have done before us. I think every faith tradition, every country has this idea that we have to know what came before. And so making it a fuller historical record benefits us all. So Jill, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for taking the time during a pandemic to turn it into something. You had some extra moments and you used those moments to benefit all of us, which just speaks to your giving heart, to your commitment to women, education, and engineering, and is such an incredible role model. Thank you for being here, Jill. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for indulging me. I met Jill and I got so excited about this book and her, and I'm so glad that you were here, and gonna spread that excitement everywhere. I will send you the recording.
Perfect.
There were so many great nuggets, and so you can go back through. We've got some nice things in the chat as well. Thank you for your participation, and happy last day of Women's History Month. I hope maybe you'll take a few minutes today to think about how you're going to take all of the energy and emphasis that we generated as women, by women, for women, with women this month, and think about how we're going to push it forward to the rest of the year. Thank you so much, everybody.
All righty. Bye-bye.